The grand salon of Aston Manor had not been this silent since the old Duke's funeral. 5 women stood in a crescent of candlelight, each one a masterpiece of other people's effort. Their mothers had spent fortunes on the silk, their governesses had drilled the posture, their maids had wept quietly at 4 in the morning over curling irons and stubborn pearl buttons. Every detail had been considered, every flaw had been corrected or concealed. They believed, with the particular certainty of the well-prepared, that the morning had already been decided in their favour. Duke Rhys Rogers entered without ceremony. He was not what the room had rehearsed for. No theatrical entrance, no sweeping acknowledgement of the assembly. He handed his gloves to a footman, adjusted the dark collar of his military-cut tunic with 2 fingers, and turned to face the crescent of women the way a man turns to face paperwork he already knows will disappoint him. He looked. Not quickly. Not with the eager appraisal of someone hoping to be impressed. He moved his gaze the way a man does when he is searching for something the room does not know it contains. First candidate. Second. The third offered her most practiced smile. He did not slow. By the 5th, the matchmaker had pressed her knuckles to her mouth. He stopped, not in front of any of them. His eyes had travelled past the candlelight, past the 5 silk hems pooling on the parquet floor, past the enormous floral arrangement that had cost the estate steward 3 sleepless days of negotiation. They had come to rest in the far corner of the room, where a young woman sat on a low stool, a pincushion balanced on her knee, her attention fixed on the torn hem of her cousin's travelling gown, as though the entire selection process was something happening in a different country entirely. She had not been introduced. Her name appeared on no list. Her dress was grey, the particular grey of a garment worn past its original purpose. Her hair was pinned rather than styled. There was a smudge of ink on her left forefinger, and a small, precise frown on her face as she worked a stitch that refused to cooperate. She did not look up. When she finally did, it was only because the silence had grown a weight she could feel on the back of her neck. Duke Rhys Rogers was staring directly at her. She glanced behind herself. Stone wall. She looked back. His voice, when it came, was unhurried, almost quiet, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without volume. Bring me the one they deem useless. No one moved. The matchmaker's breath became audible. The 5 candidates turned, toward the corner, then back, then toward the corner again, their expressions cycling through confusion, offence, and something that looked almost like relief that it was not, somehow, their fault. The girl with the pincushion slowly set down her needle. 5 shimmering futures cracked apart like the silence that had held them. Nobody in the salon of Aston Manor had expected the morning to go this way, least of all Katie Stewart. The salon did not recover gracefully. For approximately 4 seconds after Duke Rhys Rogers spoke, the room held its collective breath in the particular aristocratic paralysis that descends on people who have rehearsed every possible outcome, except the one currently happening in front of them. Then, all at once, it exhaled. The result was not pretty. Lady Ruby Stevens moved first. She always moved first. It was, her mother had told her repeatedly, one of her finest qualities. She turned from the corner where Katie Stewart sat frozen on her low stool, and she smiled. It was the kind of smile that takes years of careful social engineering to perfect, wide enough to suggest graciousness, tight enough at the edges to communicate something far less charitable. How charming, she said, to no one in particular, in the tone people use when they mean the precise opposite. The other 4 candidates unravelled with less composure. The youngest, a pale girl from the northern counties whose name Katie had never learned, simply burst into tears, which her chaperone immediately smothered beneath a silk handkerchief, as though grief were something that could be suffocated before anyone noticed. The remaining 3 arranged their faces into various configurations of dignified confusion, and began the slow, magnificent work of pretending they had not just been passed over in favour of someone holding a pincushion. The matchmaker, Mrs. Aldred, a small, efficient woman who had successfully arranged 11 noble unions and taken considerable professional pride in that number, stood very still in the centre of the room, with the expression of a woman watching 11 become irrelevant. Your Grace, she tried once more, her voice admirably steady given the circumstances. Perhaps a moment of consideration. I have considered, Rhys said. He had not moved, his eyes had not left Katie's face. Bring her forward. Katie stood. She did it slowly, the way a person does when their legs have temporarily forgotten their function. The pincushion tumbled from her knee and hit the parquet with a soft, ridiculous thud. She did not pick it up. She straightened her grey dress by instinct. It did not improve significantly. Then she walked forward, because there was nothing else to do, and because every eye in the room had made retreat geometrically impossible. What happened next occurred in two distinct theatres simultaneously. In the first, the visible one, the salon floor, Katie crossed the parquet under the weight of 60 stairs, stopped 3 feet from the Duke, and looked up at him with the expression of someone who has just been asked to account for a mistake they did not know they were making. In the second theatre, conducted entirely in furious whispers along the left wall, Katie's family was quietly coming apart at the seams. Her Aunt Cecilia, a woman whose entire social strategy had been built on the careful deployment of her 2 daughters as marriageable assets, gripped her eldest daughter Margaret's arm with a force that would leave marks. "Smile," she hissed through her teeth. "We knew. We always intended for Katie to. We were simply waiting for the right." She stopped. Even she could not finish the sentence with any structural integrity. Margaret, to her credit, smiled so hard her jaw ached. Katie's cousin Eliza, who had spent the better part of 6 months making clear to Katie exactly how peripheral she was to the family's ambitions, now watched the Duke's attention remain fixed on her plain, ink-stained, pincushion-dropping relative and experienced something she would later describe to her diary as a spiritual injury. On the other side of the room, Lady Ruby had stopped smiling. It had lasted impressively long, that smile, through the matchmaker's protest, through Katie's stumbling walk across the floor, through the first murmurs rippling through the assembled guests like wind through dry grass. But now, watching the Duke take a small step toward the girl in the grey dress and lower his voice to say something that no one else in the room could hear, Ruby's expression recalibrated into something sharper, quieter, and considerably more dangerous. She was not a woman who accepted being overlooked. She was, in fact, constitutionally incapable of it. She had been the front runner. Every whisper in every drawing room from here to the county border had agreed on that point. Her bloodline was immaculate. Her dowry was substantial. Her curtsy was, by all objective measures, flawless, and the Duke had looked past her as though she were part of the wallpaper. She filed that away somewhere cold and private and turned to her chaperone with a smile so controlled it barely moved her face. "We should freshen up before luncheon," she said pleasantly. "It's been a long morning." By the time the salon began to empty, the rejected candidates ushered toward their respective carriages and their respective mortifications. Aunt Cecilia had already constructed an entirely new reality. By her telling, whispered urgently to 3 separate acquaintances before she had even reached the corridor, the Duke's choice had been quietly anticipated. Katie, she explained with a composed nod, was simply a girl of hidden depth. Understated. The Duke, being a man of rare perception, had clearly seen what they had always known. Nobody believed her. Everyone nodded anyway. And upstairs, in the narrow room that had been assigned to Katie because it faced away from the garden, 3 of Cecilia's housemaids arrived within the hour carrying borrowed petticoats, a curling iron, and the kind of grim, cheerful efficiency reserved for impossible tasks. "Arms up," the eldest said, holding a dress that had last been worn by a cousin 2 sizes smaller than Katie. Katie raised her arms. She stared at the ceiling. Somewhere below she could still hear the salon buzzing. She had attended this selection to mend hems and remain invisible. She had apparently failed spectacularly at both. They gave her an hour, 1 hour to be transformed, by the collective anxious effort of 3 housemaids and Aunt Cecilia's hovering, from the girl who mended hems into something the Duke of Aston Manor could reasonably present to polite society without causing a diplomatic incident. The result was imperfect. The borrowed dress fit well enough in the shoulders and not at all in the waist, requiring 2 strategic pins that Katie was instructed, under no circumstances, to breathe too deeply near. Her hair had been coiled and pressed into a shape it clearly found unnatural. Someone had produced a pair of gloves a half size too small. She looked, she thought, like herself wearing a costume of herself, which was, she supposed, precisely the problem. The footman who collected her from the corridor was professional enough not to let his expression comment on any of this. He led her through the east wing of Aston Manor with the brisk neutrality of a man who had seen stranger things in this house and expected to see stranger still. He stopped before a set of dark panelled doors, knocked twice, and stepped aside. "Miss Stewart," a voice said from within. "Come in." She came in. The study was not what she had expected, though she would have struggled to say precisely what she had expected. Something more theatrical, perhaps, more in keeping with a man who made decisions that rearranged entire rooms full of people without apparent effort. Instead, it was simply a working room. Books stacked rather than arranged. Maps weighted open at the corners with whatever came to hand. A desk buried under correspondence that suggested the Dukedom of Aston was considerably more administrative than romantic fiction typically implied. Rhys Rogers stood at the window with his back to her, his dark tunic exchanged for a plainer coat, hands clasped behind him in the posture of a man who spent a great deal of time thinking at windows. He turned when she entered. His gaze moved over the borrowed dress, the architectural hair, the two small gloves. Something crossed his face briefly. Not amusement, exactly. Recognition, perhaps. "They dressed you," he said. "They did," Katie agreed. "You look uncomfortable. The gloves are half a size too small, and there are 2 pins in my waist that I've been told not to breathe near, so yes, moderately." He was quiet for a moment. Then he gestured to the chair across from his desk and moved to sit behind it, which Katie found privately reassuring. A desk between them was sensible. A desk between them was a thing she understood. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap, felt the gloves protest, and unfolded them again. Rhys studied her with the same unhurried attention he had used in the salon, the gaze of a man who was genuinely looking rather than performing the act of looking. It was, she found, both easier and harder to be on the receiving end of up close. "I imagine," he said finally, "that you have questions." "1 or 2, Katie said, "though I suspect the more pressing question is the one you should be asking yourself." He tilted his head slightly. "Which is, why you did what you did this morning." She met his eyes directly because she had never quite mastered the art of looking away at the appropriate moment. "Those 5 women were exactly what you asked for. Their families spent months preparing them. Mrs. Aldred has built her entire professional reputation on occasions like this one, and you walked past all of it to point at the person mending a hem in the corner." She paused. "That is not the behavior of a man who has thought this through." The room was very quiet. Outside, distantly, she could hear the gravel of the front drive being disturbed by departing carriages. The rejected 5 making their various exits. "You think I made a mistake," Rhys said. "It was not quite a question. I think," Katie said carefully, "that whatever you thought you saw in that corner this morning, I am very likely not it. I am not accomplished. I do not play piano with any skill worth mentioning. My French is functional rather than elegant. I have no dowry to speak of, which I suspect you already know, and which your solicitors will make abundantly clear to you the moment they are consulted. I am here because my aunt could not afford to refuse the invitation, and I was useful for carrying things." She held his gaze steadily. "I am telling you this not because I enjoy cataloguing my own deficiencies, but because someone in this room ought to be honest with you, and it is fairly clear that no one else is currently volunteering." Rhys said nothing for a long moment. He had the quality, she was beginning to notice, of a man who did not fill silences out of discomfort, who let them sit until they had finished being useful. "Are you finished?" he asked. "Largely," Katie said. "Then let me be equally honest with you." He leaned forward slightly, forearms resting on the buried desk. "I have sat across from accomplished women in this room for the better part of 3 months. Women with elegant French and considerable dowries and piano skills that their mothers have been cultivating since they were 4 years old. Every one of them told me exactly what they believed I wanted to hear." He paused. "You have been in this room for 6 minutes and have already told me 2 things I did not ask for and almost certainly needed." He sat back. "So I will ask you again whether I have made a mistake," he said. "And I will ask you to consider the possibility that you are not the most objective judge of your own value." Katie opened her mouth, closed it. It was, she realized with some irritation, a fair point. Outside, the last carriage rolled down the Aston Drive. The morning was over. Whatever came next had already quietly begun. She found Katie at 7 in the morning. Not metaphorically, she quite literally found her, in the manner of someone who had been told where Katie was and had decided to arrive before Katie could be anywhere else. Katie was in the small sitting room off the east corridor, still in her nightgown with a shawl pulled over her shoulders, attempting to return the borrowed dress to a condition that would not embarrass its original owner. She had unpicked the 2 strategic pins and was repairing the stress they had caused to the fabric with the quiet, automatic competence of someone who had been fixing other people's things for so long it had become indistinguishable from breathing. She did not hear the door open. She became aware of the Dowager Duchess Paige Rogers only when a cup of tea appeared on the small table beside her, placed there by a hand adorned with 3 rings and the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once in her life needed to announce herself. "You sew well," the dowager said, settling into the chair across from Katie as though she had been sitting in it for years. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair dressed simply and eyes the same dark shade as her son's. Though where Reese's gaze had the quality of careful assessment, his mother's had something warmer underneath it, something that had already decided and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. Katie set down the dress. "Your Grace, I apologize. I didn't hear. No apology necessary. I came quietly on purpose." She poured her own tea from the pot a maid had apparently delivered without Katie noticing that either. "I wanted to see what you did when no one was watching." Katie looked at the dress in her lap. "Apparently I mend things." "Apparently," the dowager agreed pleasantly. "Drink your tea." Katie drank her tea. For a few minutes neither of them spoke, which Katie found alarming and then, gradually, did not. There was something about the dowager's silence that was different from the weighted, performative quiet of the salon yesterday. This was the silence of a woman who had nothing to prove and had reached the age where she found that restful rather than unsettling. "You spoke plainly to my son, Sniesi," the dowager said eventually. "I may have overcorrected in that direction," Katie said. "You told him he had made a mistake. To his face, in his own study." A pause. "Do you know how many people in his acquaintance have told Reese Rogers he has made a mistake in the last 5 years? Katie considered. "Given the general atmosphere of this house, I would estimate very few." "None," the dowager said simply. "Not one. His advisors disagree with him on paper, in careful language, with appropriate qualifications. His friends, such as they are, have learned to redirect rather than contradict. And the women who have sat in that study before you said nothing of consequence whatsoever." She set down her cup. "So you will understand why he found yesterday's conversation somewhat startling." Katie was not sure whether this was a compliment or a warning, and suspected it was deliberately both. "He was not always like this," the dowager continued, and her voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more considered. The way a person's voice changes when they are speaking about something they have spent time thinking about alone. "He was not always so, contained. His father's title came to him 12 years ago, and it came badly, with debt attached and an estate that needed rebuilding, and a seat in the Lords that required twice the effort to command respect because he was 23 and looked younger. He learned very quickly that showing uncertainty was the same as inviting it to be used against you." She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt. "The armor was necessary. The difficulty is that armor, worn long enough, stops feeling like something you put on and starts feeling like something you simply are." Katie looked at her quietly. "You're telling me this because you want me to understand him." "I'm telling you this," the dowager said, "because I want you to understand that when he is cold, it is not indifference. When he is short, it is not contempt. And when he pushes, it is generally because he is waiting to see whether you will push back." She met Katie's eyes directly. "The women who came before you did not push back. They accommodated and they softened and they rearranged themselves to fit whatever shape they thought he wanted, and he found every single one of them utterly exhausting. That is a significant amount of information to share with someone you met 4 minutes ago," Katie said. The dowager smiled. It transformed her face entirely. "I have been watching people in this manner for 35 years, Miss Stewart. I have become efficient." She rose from the chair with the unhurried grace of someone who had long ago stopped performing movement for an audience. "I would like to show you the house this morning, if you are agreeable. The parts the footman won't show you. The parts that explain things words don't quite manage." Katie looked at the half-mended dress in her lap, then at the woman standing before her, then at the tea she had not quite finished. "I'll need 10 minutes to dress," she said. "I'll need 11, the dowager replied, and moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and looked back, and there was something in her expression that was fond and appraising in equal measure. "He chose correctly, incidentally, in case you were still undecided on that point." She left before Katie could formulate a response, which, Katie suspected, was entirely intentional. She found Katie at 7 in the morning. Not metaphorically, she quite literally found her, in the manner of someone who had been told where Katie was and had decided to arrive before Katie could be anywhere else. Katie was in the small sitting room off the east corridor, still in her nightgown with a shawl pulled over her shoulders, attempting to return the borrowed dress to a condition that would not embarrass its original owner. She had unpicked the 2 strategic pins and was repairing the stress they had caused to the fabric with the quiet, automatic competence of someone who had been fixing other people's things for so long it had become indistinguishable from breathing. She did not hear the door open. She became aware of the Dowager Duchess Paige Rogers only when a cup of tea appeared on the small table beside her, placed there by a hand adorned with 3 rings and the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once in her life needed to announce herself. "You sew well," the Dowager said, settling into the chair across from Katie as though she had been sitting in it for years. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair dressed simply and eyes the same dark shade as her son's. Though where Reese's gaze had the quality of careful assessment, his mother's had something warmer underneath it, something that had already decided and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. Katie set down the dress. "Your Grace, I apologize. I didn't hear. No apology necessary. I came quietly on purpose." She poured her own tea from the pot a maid had apparently delivered without Katie noticing that either. "I wanted to see what you did when no one was watching." Katie looked at the dress in her lap. "Apparently I mend things." "Apparently," the Dowager agreed pleasantly. "Drink your tea." Katie drank her tea. For a few minutes neither of them spoke, which Katie found alarming and then, gradually, did not. There was something about the Dowager's silence that was different from the weighted, performative quiet of the salon yesterday. This was the silence of a woman who had nothing to prove and had reached the age where she found that restful rather than unsettling. "You spoke plainly to my son, Sniesi," the Dowager said eventually. "I may have overcorrected in that direction," Katie said. "You told him he had made a mistake. To his face, in his own study." A pause. "Do you know how many people in his acquaintance have told Reese Rogers he has made a mistake in the last 5 years? Katie considered. "Given the general atmosphere of this house, I would estimate very few." "None," the Dowager said simply. "Not one. His advisors disagree with him on paper, in careful language, with appropriate qualifications. His friends, such as they are, have learned to redirect rather than contradict. And the women who have sat in that study before you said nothing of consequence whatsoever." She set down her cup. "So you will understand why he found yesterday's conversation somewhat startling." Katie was not sure whether this was a compliment or a warning, and suspected it was deliberately both. "He was not always like this," the Dowager continued, and her voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more considered, the way a person's voice changes when they are speaking about something they have spent time thinking about alone. "He was not always so, contained. His father's title came to him 12 years ago, and it came badly, with debt attached, and an estate that needed rebuilding, and a seat in the Lords that required twice the effort to command respect because he was 23 and looked younger. He learned very quickly that showing uncertainty was the same as inviting it to be used against you." She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt. "The armor was necessary. The difficulty is that armor, worn long enough, stops feeling like something you put on and starts feeling like something you simply are." Katie looked at her quietly. "You're telling me this because you want me to understand him." "I'm telling you this," the Dowager said, "because I want you to understand that when he is cold, it is not indifference. When he is short, it is not contempt. And when he pushes, it is generally because he is waiting to see whether you will push back." She met Katie's eyes directly. "The women who came before you did not push back. They accommodated and they softened and they rearranged themselves to fit whatever shape they thought he wanted, and he found every single one of them utterly exhausting. That is a significant amount of information to share with someone you met 4 minutes ago," Katie said. The Dowager smiled. It transformed her face entirely. "I have been watching people in this manner for 35 years, Miss Stewart. I have become efficient." She rose from the chair with the unhurried grace of someone who had long ago stopped performing movement for an audience. "I would like to show you the house this morning, if you are agreeable. The parts the footman won't show you. The parts that explain things words don't quite manage." Katie looked at the half-mended dress in her lap, then at the woman standing before her, then at the tea she had not quite finished. "I'll need 10 minutes to dress," she said. "I'll need 11, the Dowager replied, and moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and looked back, and there was something in her expression that was fond and appraising in equal measure. "He chose correctly, incidentally. In case you were still undecided on that point, she left before Katie could formulate a response, which, Katie suspected, was entirely intentional. She couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. Katie had never been a reliable sleeper. Her mind had a tendency to continue working long after the rest of her had submitted a formal request for quiet, turning over problems and conversations and unfinished tasks with the relentless industry of something that had not been informed that nighttime was supposed to be different. Tonight it was turning over Ruby's smile, the precise calibrated warmth of it, the way every question had been shaped like concern and functioned like a scalpel. She gave up at 11:30, pulled her shawl over her shoulders, and went looking for the library. The Dowager had shown it to her that morning during their tour, a long, high-ceilinged room on the manor's second floor that smelled of old paper and wood smoke, and the particular stillness of a space that is used seriously rather than decoratively. Katie had noted it the way she noted most things she wanted, quietly, without drawing attention to the wanting. She found it without much difficulty. She also found, which she had not anticipated, that it was already occupied. Rhys Rogers was at the far end of the room, seated not at the large central table, but in one of the worn leather chairs pulled close to the dying fire, his long legs extended, a sheaf of papers balanced on his knee. He had removed his coat. His cravat was loosened. There were 2 empty cups on the small table beside him and a third that was not yet empty, and the fire had burned down to the kind of low, amber glow that suggests it has been company for some time. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Miss Stewart," he said, without particular surprise. "Your Grace," she said. "I didn't know anyone was. I'll go." "You don't have to." He said it simply, without the performative graciousness of an invitation. A statement of fact rather than social courtesy, which she found, perversely, more comfortable than the alternative. He gestured toward the chair across from his, with the hand that wasn't holding the papers. "The fire's still reasonable." She came in. She sat. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked at the fire rather than at him, because looking at the fire was the sort of thing a person could do without it meaning anything. He returned to his papers. She took a book from the table beside her without checking the title and opened it to a random page and did not read a single word. After a while he set the sheaf down on top of the others and pressed 2 fingers briefly to the bridge of his nose in the gesture of a man whose head has been cooperating under protest for several hours. "Bad news?" Katie asked, before she had fully decided to speak. He looked at the papers. "Complicated news," he said, "which is generally worse." He picked up his cup. "The North tenancies have been mismanaged for the better part of 4 years. My previous steward was thorough in his records and creative in his arithmetic, which is the most damaging possible combination. The gap between what the estate appears to generate and what it actually generates is," he paused, significant. "Can it be recovered?" "Yes," he said, "with time and restructuring and a period of reduced circumstance." Something moved briefly across his face. "The difficulty is that a duke in reduced circumstance is a particular kind of target. Every obligation, every alliance, every arrangement that was agreed upon in the assumption of a certain weight behind the title becomes negotiable. And people who find things negotiable tend to negotiate in their own direction." Katie looked at him for a moment. In the low firelight, he looked less like the figure who had commanded a silent salon and more like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had simply become so accustomed to the weight that he'd stopped, noticing he was bent under it. The armor the Dowager had described. She could see the edges of it now, the precise way he framed everything in the language of strategy and management, the way he spoke about his own life, as though it were a set of problems belonging to someone he administered, rather than inhabited. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked at her. "You generally do. Do you ever not want it?" She held his gaze. "The title, the obligations, all of it. Do you ever think about what you would do if it simply wasn't yours to carry?" The fire shifted. A log dropped quietly into itself and sent up a brief constellation of sparks. "Constantly," he said. The word came out with the flatness of something true that has been compressed for a long time. Katie was quiet for a moment. Then, because the hour was late, and the fire was low, and something about both of those things made honesty feel less expensive than it usually did, she said, "I used to think that being useless was the worst thing a person could be, that it was a kind of failure, a moral one." She looked at her hands in her lap. "But there are moments, quiet ones, early in the morning before anyone needs anything, where I think that being useless might be the only way to be free. That the moment you become necessary to people, they own a piece of you. And the more necessary you become, the less of you remains that is simply yours. The room was very still. Reese was watching her with the focused, unhurried attention she was beginning to recognize as his version of being moved by something. That, he said quietly, is the most honest thing anyone has said in this library in recent memory. The bar appears to be low, Katie said. He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him come to it, a slight shift at one corner of his mouth, barely there, gone almost before it arrived. Get some sleep, Miss Stewart, he said. The fire's nearly done. She closed the book she hadn't read. She stood. She paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said, without turning around, I think you carry it well, even when it's too heavy. She didn't wait for a response. She slipped out into the dark corridor and pulled the door quietly behind her and walked back to her room in the particular, complicated peace of someone who had said a true thing out loud and survived it. Abby Bell was not technically supposed to talk to her. This was not a formal prohibition. No one had sat Abby down and explained that the lady's maid assigned to assist Miss Stewart during her stay at Aston Manor was to limit her conversation to matters of hairpins and hem lengths. It was more the unspoken architecture of a house like this one, the invisible lines that structured who spoke to whom and about what and for how long. Abby was 22, quick-eyed, and had worked at Aston Manor for 4 years, which was long enough to understand the architecture precisely and to have developed her own quiet opinions about when it deserved to be respected. She came to Katie the following morning while helping her dress, and she did it the way people in service learn to do difficult things, efficiently, without preamble, while keeping her hands occupied with something else entirely so that the conversation could be denied if it needed to be. I need to tell you something, she said, working the buttons at the back of Katie's dress with practiced speed. And I need you to hear it without reacting visibly because there's a footman in the corridor who notices things. Katie went very still. All right, she said to the mirror. Lady Ruby's personal attendant, Clara, has a cousin who works at the coaching inn on the Merston Road. Abby's fingers moved steadily up the buttons. 3 days ago, a messenger left Aston wearing Ruby's colours. Clara told the laundry girl, who told the kitchen maid, who told me. A brief pause. He was heading in the direction of your home district, Miss Stewart. Clara says Ruby gave him specific instructions. He was looking for records. The mirror showed Katie her own face, and she was grateful she had been warned not to react, because the thing that moved across her expression in that moment needed a second to be managed before it was fit to be seen. What kind of records, she said. It was not quite a question, financial ones. Abby finished the last button and smoothed the fabric at Katie's shoulders with a small, precise gesture. Your family's accounts, debts, any arrangements that might be irregular. She met Katie's eyes in the mirror briefly and then returned her gaze to the dress. I don't know what she expects to find. I only know she sent someone to find it. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Aston grounds were doing their usual impression of serenity. The formal gardens, the clipped hedgerows, the gravel paths raked into perfect parallel lines. Katie looked at them and thought about her father's study at home, the stacks of correspondence on his desk, the particular way he changed the subject when money was mentioned at dinner, the creditor's letters she had twice intercepted from the Morning Post before her aunt could see them and use them as social ammunition. She knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who has lived close to a problem for a long time, exactly what Lady Ruby's messenger was going to find. Thank you, she said, for telling me. I want you to know, Abby said, straightening the cuffs of Katie's sleeves with unnecessary care, that not everyone in this house thinks the way Lady Ruby does, about who belongs here and who doesn't. She said it to the cuffs rather than to Katie, which was the only way it could be said without either of them having to acknowledge it directly. That's all. She collected the discarded nightgown from the chair and left with the swift, unobtrusive efficiency that 4 years of service had made second nature. Katie sat down on the edge of the bed. She sat there for several minutes, which was a luxury she did not really have but took anyway, because some information requires a moment of being simply held before it can be acted upon. She thought about Ruby in the south parlour, the cream paper invitation, the rose silk, the questions shaped like concern. She had known, sitting across from that smile, that it was reconnaissance. She had not known Ruby had already moved past reconnaissance into active operation before the tea was even poured. She thought about her father, about the debts, which were real and considerable, and had the particular character of debts that had been managed through optimism rather than mathematics for several years running, about what those debts would look like on paper, extracted from context and presented to a roomful of people who had already decided what they wanted to conclude, about what it would mean for her family if that paper reached the wrong hands at the wrong moment in the wrong room. She stood up. She went to the small writing desk in the corner of her room and sat down at it and took out a sheet of paper and then sat looking at the paper for a long time without writing anything, because the question was not whether to act but what action, precisely, was available to her. She could write to her father, warn him that someone was asking questions, but the coaching road between Aston and home was 2 days in each direction, and Ruby's messenger had a 3-day head start, which made warning a comfort rather than a strategy. She could say nothing and hope the information found was insufficient. She dismissed this almost immediately. Hope was not a strategy either. It was what people reached for when they had run out of strategies, and she was not there yet, which left the third option, the one that sat at the back of her mind with the patient, uncomfortable weight of the only correct answer to a problem she had very much hoped had a different solution. She needed to tell Reese before Ruby did, before the paper trail became a public one, before the story was told by someone with a vested interest in the telling. She needed to walk into that study, sit down at that desk, and hand him the one piece of information that could end everything, on her own terms, in her own words, before it was taken from her hands entirely. She folded the blank piece of paper carefully in half. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and went to find the Duke. He was in the study again. She was beginning to think he was always in the study, that the room and the man had reached some long-standing arrangement whereby he remained inside it and it contained him, and the rest of Aston Manor simply organized itself around that central fact. The door was open this time, which she chose to interpret as permission rather than oversight, and she knocked twice on the frame before entering. Reese looked up from his desk. His expression did the small, almost imperceptible shift it made when it was her. Not warmer exactly, but less guarded in some way she had stopped trying to precisely define. "Miss Stewart," he said, "sit down." "In a moment," she said. She closed the door behind her, which was not the done thing and which she did anyway, because what she had come to say was not a conversation that needed an audience. She crossed to the chair across from his desk and stood behind it with both hands resting on its back, and she looked at him directly. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need to tell you before someone else does, because the version someone else tells will be designed to do damage, and I would prefer you to have the unedited one first." Something in his posture adjusted, a slight straightening, an attention that had already been considerable becoming more so. He set down his pen. He said nothing, which was his way of indicating she should continue. She continued. "My family is in debt," she said. "Not the manageable kind, not the kind that a good season resolves or a sensible marriage quietly absorbs. The significant kind. My father made a series of investments 6 years ago that were presented to him as sound and were not, and the losses can compounded in the way losses do when they are not addressed directly, which my father, who is a good man with a genuine gift for not seeing things he finds distressing, did not address directly." She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed this in the corridor, not the words exactly, but the tone of them, the particular neutrality that separates disclosure from performance. "The creditors are known. The amounts are documented. There are letters, records, a paper trail that is neither hidden nor difficult to find for anyone who looks with purpose." She held his gaze. "Lady Ruby has sent someone to look with purpose." The study was very quiet. Reese's face had not changed in the way she had been braced for, no visible recoil, no rapid reassessment behind the eyes. He simply watched her with the steady, unreadable attention she had come to understand was not coldness but concentration. He was listening, fully, without the fraction of his attention already composing a response. It was, she had come to realize, one of his rarest qualities, the capacity to hear a thing completely before deciding what to do with it. "How much?" he said. She told him. The number sat between them on the desk like something physical. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "And your family knows you're here telling me this?" "No," she said. "My family would be horrified. My aunt would consider it a catastrophic tactical error. She believes these things should be managed through misdirection and strategic optimisms until they resolve themselves or someone else deals with them. A brief pause. They have not, thus far, resolved themselves. But you came anyway. I came anyway, she agreed. Because the alternative was waiting for Ruby to walk into a room full of people with a sheaf of documents and a smile, and I find I have very little appetite for being the subject of that particular theatre. She straightened slightly, hands still resting on the back of the chair. I am not asking you to fix it. I am not asking for anything. I am telling you because you are the one person in this house who has consistently indicated a preference for the truth over the comfortable version of it, and it seemed consistent to extend you the same courtesy. Something moved across his face. Not the almost smile she had seen in the library, something quieter than that, something that took longer to arrive and carried more weight when it did. He stood up. He did not come around the desk. He simply stood, which had the effect of changing the geometry of the room in a way she felt without quite being able to articulate. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not assessing, not contained. Something more direct than either of those things. Katie, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and he said it without apparent awareness that he was doing something different, which made it considerably more significant than if he had chosen it deliberately. I need to tell you something as well. She waited. The debts, he said. Your family's creditors. He paused for a fraction of a second in the manner of a man selecting the precise words for something that has already been decided. I bought them 3 weeks ago. The room did not move. Katie was fairly certain she did not move. The fire continued with complete indifference. I beg your pardon, she said. The paper trail Ruby is chasing leads to a dead end, he said. The debts exist in record, but the creditor of record is now the Aston estate, which means they are mine to call in or to cancel as I see fit. He held her gaze. I had intended to tell you at a more considered moment. You have somewhat accelerated the timeline. Katie looked at him for a long moment. The courage it had taken to walk through that door, the carefully leveled voice, the rehearsed neutrality, all of it was still present, but reorganizing itself around a fact she had not had when she arrived, and was not entirely sure what to do with now. You did that, she said slowly, before you had any reason to. I had a reason, he said quietly. The fire shifted. Outside, the Aston grounds held their usual magnificent silence. That was not nothing, Katie said at last, which was perhaps the least elegant sentence she had ever produced, and was also, she felt, the most honest one available to her in that particular moment. No, Reese agreed. It was not nothing. They stood on opposite sides of the desk in the afternoon quiet of the study, and something that had been building since a girl with a pincushion looked up from a low stool and found a duke staring at her, settled at last, into a shape that both of them could see clearly. Neither of them moved toward it yet, but neither of them looked away. The gala had been planned before any of this began. It was an annual fixture, the Aston Autumn Gathering, 300 guests drawn from the county's best families. The manor lit from every window and the long dining table extended to its full, impractical length. It was the kind of evening that functioned as both celebration and audit, where the local gentry arrived in their finest and spent the better part of 4 hours assessing one another's circumstances with the practiced subtlety of people who had been doing exactly that for generations. This year, the audit had a focal point. Katie was aware of it from the moment she entered the dining room on the dowager's arm. The way attention moved toward her and then away. The conversations that paused a half-beat too long, the assessments conducted through the mechanism of not quite looking directly. She had dressed carefully, which in her case meant the best of the borrowed things, a deep blue that the dowager had produced from somewhere without explanation, and which fit considerably better than anything her aunt's housemaids had attempted. Her hair was simply arranged. There were no strategic pins. She looked, she had decided that morning, like herself. That would have to be sufficient. Reese found her before dinner was announced. He appeared at her side with the quiet, deliberate ease of a man who had decided where he intended to be, and seen no reason to make a production of arriving there, and he offered his arm without particular ceremony. "How are you?" he said, not the social version of the question. Remarkably composed given the circumstances, Katie said. "You?" "The same." A brief pause. "Stay near me tonight." She looked up at him. "Is that a request or an instruction?" "Whichever one you'll actually follow," he said, and she almost smiled, and they went in to dinner. Ruby had positioned herself 3 seats down on the opposite side of the table. which gave her sightlines to both Katie and the room's most influential guests simultaneously. Katie noticed this because she had spent enough time in rooms with Ruby to understand that her seating choices were never accidental. She was in ivory tonight, a deliberate choice, Katie suspected, the color of brides and innocence and prior claim. Her smile over the first course was radiant and general, distributed across the table, with the even-handed warmth of a woman who had nothing but goodwill for everyone present and was simply waiting for the correct moment to demonstrate it. The moment came between the third and fourth courses. It arrived in the form of a question, the most effective weapon in a certain kind of arsenal because it requires no accusation, only the appearance of innocent inquiry. Ruby addressed it to the table at large in the pleasant tone of someone sharing a mildly interesting observation. "I wonder," she said, during a natural lull in the conversation, "whether anyone else has had occasion to look into the Stewart family history. I only ask because I've recently come across some rather illuminating records from their home district." She let the pause breathe. Around the table, Fawkes stilled almost imperceptibly. "Matters of finance, primarily. It seems there are some quite significant irregularities." She turned to Katie with an expression of exquisite concern. "I'm sure it's nothing you're not already aware of, Miss Stewart. I simply feel that in the interest of transparency, these things ought to be in the open, particularly given your position here." The dining room performed its collective intake of breath. Katie set down her fork. She had known this was coming. Had known since the south parlor, since Abby's warning, since she had sat on the edge of her bed, and understood that Ruby was not the kind of woman who gathered ammunition without intending to use it. Knowing had not made sitting inside the moment any more comfortable, but it had given her the one thing that mattered. She was not surprised. And in a room where surprise was a vulnerability, the absence of it was its own kind of armor. She opened her mouth. Reese spoke first. "The Stewart family finances," he said, in the quiet, unhurried voice that carried without effort to every corner of the room, "are a matter I'm fully acquainted with." He did not look at Ruby. He addressed the table with the particular, calibrated ease of a man who had spent years commanding rooms and had simply decided to do so now. "I have been acquainted with them for some weeks. The relevant debts are held by the Aston estate and will be resolved as a matter of course." He lifted his wineglass with the unhurried ease of someone closing a door on a subject that no longer merited discussion. "I appreciate Lady Ruby's concern for transparency. It is a quality I admire enormously when it is applied consistently." The table was very still. Reese set down his glass, and now for the first time he turned to look at Ruby directly. "I wonder," he said with perfect pleasantness, "whether you might extend us the same transparency regarding the nature of the inquiry you commissioned into Miss Stewart's private family affairs. The messenger, the records request, the rather considerable effort involved in gathering information about a guestess in my house without my knowledge for the purposes of," he paused, appearing to consider the word with genuine care, "Deemland." Ruby's face did not collapse. She was too skilled for that. But something behind it did. Some structural element that had been bearing weight quietly gave way, and the room saw it, and she knew the room saw it, which was worse than any accusation. "I was only," she began. "You were only," Reese agreed gently, and said nothing further, which was more devastating than anything that could have followed. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then the dowager, seated at the head of the table, lifted her own glass and turned to the guest on her left with a remark about the quality of the autumn's first pressing, and the room, understanding that the evening had been authoritatively redirected, followed. Conversations resumed. Forks moved. The fourth course arrived. Ruby did not speak again for the remainder of the dinner. Across the table, Katie looked at Reese. He was already looking at her, had perhaps not stopped, with the expression she had last seen in the study when he told her about the debts. That same quality of something decided, something no longer provisional. Under the table, where no one could observe it, she unfolded her hands from the tight, careful clasp she had held them in since Ruby spoke, and let them rest open in her lap. It was, in its way, the most honest thing she had done all evening. The guests left in the slow, unhurried way of people who have had a satisfying evening, and are not quite ready to surrender it to the ordinary business of going home. Katie watched from the upper landing as the last carriages rolled down the Aston Drive, their lanterns tracing small amber paths through the dark before the night absorbed them entirely. The manor settled around her as it always did when the performance was over. a different quality of quiet from the daytime one, deeper and more honest, the kind that only arrives when a house stops being observed and returns to simply being itself. She had changed out of the blue dress. She was back in her grey one, which was either a statement or a comfort, and she had stopped trying to determine which. Her hair was down, her feet were in slippers rather than the borrowed heels that had made the evening's long hours considerably more effortful than they needed to be. She was, she realized, standing in the middle of Aston Manor looking more like herself than she had at any point since arriving, which felt significant in a way she wasn't quite ready to examine. "Miss Stewart," she turned. Reese was at the far end of the landing, his formal coat exchanged for the plainer one she associated with the study and the late hours and the version of him that existed when the Duke had been set aside for the evening. He had a glass in one hand. He looked tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been performing competence for a roomful of people for 4 consecutive hours. "I was looking for you," he said. "I was watching the carriages," she said. He came to stand beside her at the landing rail and looked down at the empty entrance hall below. The flowers that had been magnificent 6 hours ago now slightly diminished, the chandelier reduced to a third of its evening brightness, the footman moving through the quiet work of restoration with the patient efficiency of people accustomed to putting grandeur away at the end of the night. "Thank you," Katie said, "for what you did at dinner. You would have handled it," he said. "Eventually," she agreed. "You were faster." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without particular preamble, in the way she had come to understand was simply how he moved toward things that mattered. "I want to ask you something. And I want to ask it plainly, without the architecture of a formal arrangement around it, because I think you would find the architecture insulting, and I find I have very little patience for it tonight." Katie turned to look at him. "All right," she said. "Stay," he said, "not for the week. Not as a candidate or a social experiment or a decision I made in a moment of, whatever the room chose to call it that morning in the salon." He looked at her with the steady, unguarded attention that she had catalogued and returned to many times in the past week and still found she was not entirely prepared for when it arrived at full strength. "Stay because this house is better with you in it. Because I am better, more honest, more awake to myself in a way I had stopped expecting to be." A brief pause. "Because you are the first person who has sat across from me and spoken to the man rather than the title, and I had not understood until you did it how much I needed someone to." The landing was very still. Below, a footman extinguished a candelabra and the entrance hall dimmed by degrees. Katie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the girl who had arrived at Aston Manor with a pincushion and a carefully maintained invisibility, who had sat in corners by design and made herself small by practice, and had built an entire internal architecture around the premise that her value was proportional to her utility, and that being needed was the closest thing to being wanted that she was likely to access. She thought about the library at midnight, about the south parlour and Ruby's smile, and the blank piece of paper she had folded in half without writing on it, about a study with a desk between them and a number that sat in the air like something physical, and a man who had bought her family's debts 3 weeks before he had any reason to. For a reason, he had said simply and without elaboration. She thought about the dowager over morning tea saying she was not the most objective judge of her own value, which had irritated her at the time, and had been, she now conceded, entirely correct. "I have spent a considerable amount of my life," she said slowly, "making myself easy to overlook. Not from modesty, from habit, from the accumulated evidence of a great many rooms in which being noticed produced worse outcomes than being invisible." She held his gaze. "I came here to mend hems and carry things and go home unobserved, and instead I have told a duke he made a mistake, taken tea with a woman who wanted to destroy me, confessed my family's financial ruin in a closed study, and survived a gala at which I was briefly the subject of a public unmasking." She paused. "It has been an extremely full week." "It has," Reese agreed. "I'm not going to become someone else," she said. "I don't play piano elegantly. My French is functional. I will continue to say things that are inconvenient and notice things that people would prefer went unnoticed and disagree with you when I think you're wrong, which based on limited evidence appears to be one of the qualities you find least objectionable about me." "It is," he said, "near the top of the list." She looked at him, at the tiredness behind the steadiness, at the man underneath the armor, at the particular quality of stillness he had when he was waiting for something that mattered and was trying not to show that it mattered. She understood, standing there on the landing of a house she had arrived in as furniture, that choosing him was not the counterpoint to choosing herself. It was the same choice made once from a place of sufficient self-knowledge to mean something. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right, I'll stay." She held his gaze. "Not because I'm useful, not because it resolves anything for my family or satisfies any obligation or makes me easier to categorize." She let the words settle. "Because I want to. Which is, I think, the first time I have done something for precisely that reason." Something shifted in his expression. Not the almost smile, not the controlled attention. Something that had not been there before, or had been there in pieces, and had simply, at this particular moment, assembled itself into a form that could be seen clearly. He offered his hand, not the formal gesture of a duke to a candidate. The simple, unadorned extension of one person's hand toward another, in the quiet of a house that had stopped performing for the evening. Katie looked at it for exactly 1 second, then she took it. Below them the last candelabra went out, and Aston Manor settled into the deep, unhurried dark of a house that had, after a very long time, found what it had been missing, not in a throne room or a salon or a line of shimmering silk, but on a low stool in a corner, with ink on her finger and a pincushion on her knee, waiting to be seen by someone who finally knew how to look. The end. It has been an honor walking this story out with you. From the moment Duke Rhys Rogers raised his gloved hand in that crowded salon and pointed past every carefully prepared candidate toward a girl in a grey dress with ink on her finger, something quietly extraordinary began. Thank you for staying with Katie and Rhys through every stolen conversation, every sharp word, every moment of armor slowly coming undone. They deserved readers who paid attention, and you did. If this story found something in you, a feeling, a thought, a moment where you held your breath without quite meaning to, let me know in the comments. I read everyone. And if you would like to be present for the next story, the next room, the next character waiting in a corner to be seen, like this post, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. The next one is already coming. Don't miss it.